the real reason why Walmart is closing multiple stores in the US? The answer will floor you. Walmart's was in the limelight for some time now, since last year, before the summer, and discussion of converting some of their stores, and their latest ploy of now closing multiple stores across the US, and the number is a total of 154. But what is the reason, the real reason for closing 154 stores? One major news channel reported that it's because these Walmart stores that are closing are located in very small urban areas, and therefore they don't have enough customers to remain opened. Let's revert and refer to the Soviet Union, who took away the ownership of land from their citizens and herded them into cities, causing rural areas to depopulate and become ghost towns. And those rural areas were, of course, eventually controlled by the government, who had the ownership, and conglomerates and big farming companies were using the land that once belonged to the people. The populace was herded into tiny apartments. For example, a family could be living in an apartment about 400 to 800 square feet, while the rural areas were controlled by the government. So the government was also controlling their food, of course. And it seems that this is what's happening in the United States, and referring to Agenda 21, it's going to be implemented. Not to mention NAFTA, that's another movement to spur people into the cities, starting with the farmers. The US, Mexico, and Canada are all part of this agreement, and under the NAFTA agreement, farmers' income has drastically decreased, and millions have lost their land. The result is that the government-subsidized farms have thrived and are left to fill the gaps. That means that the GMOs and the less healthy organic food, increasing the cost of organic products we see on shelves today. So, like the saying goes, if you control the food, you control the people. That's what it's all about. It's an enforcement of Agenda 21 to shift people from rural areas into cities. And of course, they cannot live in the rural areas when they have no jobs and they're facing starvation and job losses. Removing resources such as Walmart stores, infrastructure such as roads around towns, as refusing funds, monies to the local rural areas, will forcibly reduce population in those areas. This is what happened in China when they implemented Agenda 21. The citizens of China were forcibly removed, and Chinese farmers left their rural homes in order to be herded into Chinese cities, leaving massive ghost towns, created, of course, by the Chinese government. But what is exactly Agenda 21? It's a non-binding, voluntary implemented action plan of the United Nations with regard to sustainable development. It's a product of the Earth Summit of Brazil of 1992. It's an action agenda for the UN and other multilateral organizations and individual governments around the world that can be executed at local, national, and global levels. The 21 in agenda refers to the 21st century. It's been affirmed and had a few modifications subsequent to the UN conferences. And it has structures and content, 700 pages of documents with 40 chapters in 4 groups. The 4 groups are Section 1, social and economic dimensions directed towards combating poverty, especially in developing countries, changing consumption patterns, promoting health, achieving a more sustainable population, sustainable settlement, and in decision-making. Section 2. Conservation and management of resources for development, including atmospheric protection, combating deforestation, protecting fragile environments, conservation of biological diversity, that's biodiversity. This is important. Control of population. Control of population. Control of population and the management of biotechnology and radioactive wastes. Well, maybe it's because they don't have places to store all this radioactive waste that they're also emptying the rural areas. They need places to store all this. Section 3. Strengthening the role of major groups, including the roles of children and youth, women, NGOs, local authorities, business and industry and workers, and strengthening the role of indigenous people, their communities, and farmers. What farmers? All the farmers are moving into the cities. Farmers are thrown off their land in one way or another. If they don't have ways, roads of getting their produce to where they want them to go, but they don't have loans given to them by banks or the government subsidies, then there will be no farmers in the rural areas. Section 4. Means of implementation. Implementation includes science, technology transfer, education, international institutions, and financial mechanisms. So we see that it's a depopulation agenda having to do with farming, anything we eat, and the sovereignty of our countries. Agenda 21 is a non-binding, voluntarily implemented action plan of the UN, the United Nations, with regard to sustainable development. It's a product of the Earth Summit held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 1992. It's an action agenda for the UN, other multilateral organizations, and individual governments around the world that can be executed at local, national, and global levels. The 21 in Agenda 21 refers to the 21st century, and a few modifications have subsequently been done to it. The structures and contents of it. It's a 700-page document divided into 40 chapters having 4 groups, and the groups are very interesting if we read what they entail. Section 1, Social and Economic Dimensions, is directed towards combating poverty, especially in developing countries, changing consumption patterns, promoting health, achieving a more sustainable population. So there's the depopulation agenda, and sustainable settlement in decision making, and also settlements as to where you live. Section 2, conservation management of resources for development, including atmospheric protection, combating deforestation, protecting fragile environments, conservation of biological diversity, that's biodiversity, control of pollution, and the management of biotechnology and radioactive wastes. Management of radioactive wastes. Is that a reason perhaps that they want to move populations away from the rural areas? They need more areas perhaps into where these radioactive wastes have to be stored. Section 3. Strengthening the role of major groups, including the roles of children and youth, women, NGOs, local authorities, businesses and industries, workers, and strengthening the role of indigenous people, their communities, and farmers. Strengthening the role of farmers. How can you do that when they have to leave their farms and enter the cities? And what kind of work are they going to find there as day laborers, no doubt? Section 4. Means of implementation. Implementation includes science, technology transfer, education, international institutions, and financial mechanisms. That's how you're going to implement it, through financial mechanisms. Cut off the funding to the rural areas in order to lessen the productive assets such as roads, flood management, and that way people will perhaps be forced to move into the cities. Let's say you're a farmer. You have a drought. You have no produce. You have no livestock. What are you going to do? You go broke, you can't pay your loans, you have to move into the city. That's one theory. And Agenda 21, implementation. The Commission of Sustainable Development acts as a high-level forum on substantial development, has acted as preparatory committee for the summits and sessions on the implementation of Agenda 21 through the UN Division of Sustainable Development Act. Now, there are specific countries. For example, in the UN, the national focal point in the United States is the Division Chief for Sustainable Development of the U.S. Department of State. In June of 2012, there was a poll taken of 1,300 United States voters by the American Planning Association, and that poll found that only 9% supported Agenda 21. 85% thought they didn't have enough information to form an opinion. Only 9% support. And there's an opposition to it, of course. In the last 10 years, Agenda 21 opposition has increased within the US at the local, state, and federal levels. At the federal level, the Republican National Committee has adopted a resolution opposing Agenda 21, and the Republican Party platform stated, "We strongly reject the UN Agenda 21 as erosive of American sovereignty." Several states and local governments have considered or passed motions and legislation opposing Agenda 21. Alabama was the first state to prohibit government participation in Agenda 21, so Alabama said no Agenda 21 for us. Many other states, including Arizona, are drafting and close to passing legislation to ban Agenda 21. There are activists associated with movements against Agenda 21, saying there's a conspiracy by the United Nations to deprive individuals of their property rights, which is, of course, in the U.S. Constitution. Everyone has a right to own property, of course, unless you're a communist country. So columnists opposed Agenda 21 and the property rights movement in the U.S., of course, also. So there you have it. It seems that Walmart could be a part of this Agenda 21, close up areas where people can obtain resources, their daily food, their prepared food, and for, of course, the other fact is that they'll have no jobs from such little stores, because a lot of farmers even supplement their farming income by having part-time jobs in places like Walmart, for example. I'll leave a link below for you for these.